Namaskara and welcome to We, the City, a space where we explore everything that shapes our urban lives, from design and urbanism to art, books, and socio-cultural conversations and many more. This podcast is a neutral platform created to listen, learn, and engage with diverse voices and perspectives without endorsing or dismissing any point of view. Together, let's uncover the many layers that make our cities and communities what they are. These conversations are brought to you by EMARC Urban Design, BMS School of Architecture, Yelahanka, Bengaluru.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of We the City. I'm Renjin Cherian, Assistant Professor for the EMARC Urban Design Program at BMS School of Architecture, Yelahanka, Bengaluru. Today we celebrate the World Urbanism Day and our guest is Ms. Vaishanavi T.G. Shankar. Welcome to the first episode of We the City. Ms. Vaishanavi is an urban development professional who loves how cities work and is looking for ways to make them more resilient. She has worked at National Institute of Urban Affairs in New Delhi and now she is with Vasudha Foundation. So Vaishanavi, could you share with our listeners about your journey so far?
Hi Ranjan. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here and of course to follow the series as well. So I recently moved back to Bangalore after about 12 years of living in different cities across India, mostly for work. And coming back has been like a conscious decision and a choice to be close to the big extended family of mine and also for my daughter to grow around them and in a sense to become like a true Bangalorean. Like, you know, I want to say if you know what that means, and I hope we'll unpack that later in this discussion.
Sure.
So I think that a professional journey began in an architectural practice, where I was early drawn towards sustainable practices. And I had a chance to work with architects who championed this beautifully in the early years. And this also took me to Auroville for some time where I volunteered and worked around, basically spent time there. And that experience deeply sort of influenced my thinking about community and living sustainably and what that means.
So this was during your internship or?
This was after my architecture.
After your architecture.
Yeah. And after that, I moved to Ahmedabad. And that shift was also like a shift in my profession because it moved from architectural practice to urban development. And so I worked with a couple of organizations there. One was India Habitat Forum, where we worked with the Indira Awas Yojana beneficiaries. So these are like economically weaker section people, and the government gives them money to build houses. So we brought together architects and co-designed houses for them, but made of bamboo. I mean, the idea we came from was sustainability and to explore this material and how houses can be built. But, that process entirely also kind of highlighted collaboration, one, of course, but also about dignity and what is the idea of sustainability and for whom. Because one of the beneficiaries highlighted saying, okay, these houses are fine, but it is still made of bamboo. And for them, that still felt like, we pakka and kacha house, right? So for them, it's still like a kacha house and not like a symbol of development or growth. Right. They really needed like a brick and cement sort of a house. So, that kind of like highlighted when we romanticize what sustainability is, we also need to understand the equity angle and how that can be like brought into it. So I think that has stayed with me since then. And I worked with other grassroots organizations looking at spatial design and how that can strengthen, say, social cohesion to some extent in resettled communities and looking at conserving heritage. How can that bring the economic value for that? And this was in Ahmedabad with the Mahila Housing Seva Trust. So I think, my inclination towards sustainability and then looking at what beyond architecture kind of like was further refined with these sort of experiences, looking at how urban design can empower communities and to some extent address inequalities. And later that I moved to the National Institute of Urban Affairs where I helped set up the Climate Center for Cities and where we worked very closely with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, looking at how we can mainstream climate action, how we can build a shared understanding of what climate action would be like in cities, looking at flood resilience, looking at nature-based solutions and, various other sort of aspects. And now back in Bangalore, I'm with Vasudha Foundation where I lead the efforts to strengthen climate resilience in small and medium cities and kind of bridge that gap between policy to practice. So that's where I am now.
Great. So, what has the larger influence? Is the architecture education or your training in urban development background? Which one has more influence on you today, or is it both of them together?
Right. I would probably break this out into a multiple, maybe 2 or 3 sort of subsets of this kind. One is, of course, education and the exposure it gives you. So when I say education, it's not just what you learn in the classrooms, but in general, that system, that the exposure that you get. Maybe I can give an example of one workshop that we had in the early years in my architecture course. So we had architect Gurdev Singh, who was earlier at the Canberra University, and I think he's moved to India now. So he introduced us to a process called abstraction. So early on, how do we design anything? We look at bubbles, we look at spatial and kind of give a form to it.
Yes, I know the bubble diagram very well. It's the most iconic drawing. Yeah.
The process to get there is not something that is discussed extensively. So we don't have an avenue of converting what we have in our mind into paper or into like a form, right? So that was like a revelation where he said abstraction, which is, he said, go to your library or go to your phone or whatever, pick any image that you want and see how you want to draw that into something else. It was not about an outcome of a building or anything of that sort. So we really didn't know what the process was. So we went and picked some images that we thought made sense. And I picked up a flower with like a small water drop at the end of it. And then he said, see what interests you in this image and try to abstract what it is. So that water drop was what fascinated me. So I picked that shape and started developing that shape into some different forms, not with an intent of a building, but just, it's like a process. And this was like a few weeks. And then, of course, he helped us a lot on, translating that into a building. So eventually that shape turned into trusses and it became like a gallery. And the wall was like a gabion wall, which held these trusses.
Right.
And I'm sure we could have arrived at there in different processes, right? So it's that process that kind of like was very novel and everyone in the class were like really in awe with this process. Unfortunately, we didn't have any other avenue. So the rest of the semesters, we were all falling back to this as a process to get to the design.
Right.
But that is, it's a process. It's about that critical thinking, right? As to what we can do to get there was something that really stayed with me. And one is, of course, a personal inclination of what draws to you, right? For me, it was sustainability, it was vernacular architecture. So even my internship and other things that I did, I was drawn towards, that direction. And the third was, at least, what has shaped where I am today is the informed decision on working before doing my higher education. I think it was about testing waters, trying to understand where my heart lies and also what skills I can bring to the table. It has to be like a marriage of both of these. And so that's when I decided to do masters at LSE. And it was a very conscious decision that it should not be urban design, it should not be urban planning, but more as a theory and as research for me to understand cities better and get into that space. So it was a conscious decision, and that I was able to reach there only because of the work experience, like because of my volunteering and working with different organizations at the grassroots. I sort of like reached there. And again, the same critical thinking component in London, in these universities was very interesting, because there, you read papers and it's not about what is in the paper, but what do we interpret out of that? So we would have like group discussions on that. And I think I still remember one discussion on metros and having women coaches in the metros. Right? Mm-hmm. So it makes sense where women who want to go out, but maybe in the families they don't let them because you have to go in a crowded bus. So then if you have like a coach specific for women, then they have more agency to like say go. And once women can go out, they can work, they can do many things, right? It just builds their agency. But there were other group of people saying like, you have to just change the societal norm. You can't like have these separation just because you want to give them agency. It has to be the societal change overall. So but eventually we came to say it has to be like an incremental thing in nature. Maybe you introduce these coaches to begin with, bring people out, and then slowly build on to say then at some point maybe we don't have these coaches. So then, as a society, everyone is understanding what public transport is and that they can go out.
It's like the chicken and egg story. Who came first, the chicken or the egg kind of?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
But having that long-term sort of a thing, as to say, what is the problem? How do we address it? And it doesn't have to be like the immediate one. So I think those conversations and those debates were also sort of crucial when I come back to like the urban development and my current practice, in a sense, which gave me that grounding and that reality check, which is very required, in the policy at least work that I currently do.
Right. So we understand you're coming from an urban development background. Also, there are these different disciplines, like transportation, infrastructure, environment, housing. Then there is this whole aspect of urban planning. So can you break it down for all of these to our listeners?
Yeah. So urban development, let me start with like what a city is, right? Like I would say it's like a living organism with like you have your transport, which is like your network, your nerves, and you have like green spaces, which is your lungs and things like that, right? So I mean, there are many philosophies of what we see as a city. It could be like Lee Cobb's, which is a machine, right?
Yes.
It has to be well oiled, it has to be functioning. Or maybe you look at Jane Jacobs, who says it's a living organism. It's the people who shape these cities. So I would probably say I lie somewhere in between these two. So we need it as a machine. We need things to run as well. Because in the current statement, we have a lot of people in the city who are coming here for opportunities. They need to have access to those opportunities. But it shouldn't be like a machine. It should also bring in that people flavor. So, somewhere in between, it's a tough ask. But I think that's where I kind of like stand.
I'm more of a Jane Jacobs guy in case if you're interested.
I think we can, probably discuss more after this. But all of these, I think when we come to urban planning, right, there are specializations. As when you look at a course, you can do environment as a specialization, you can do infrastructure as a specialization. But what is important is the systemic thinking. Like all of this is a puzzle in the larger picture. So where these fit in and how you can bring that larger holistic understanding is what's sort of important. And hopefully, I think in urban planning, I think many universities are starting to look at it in that holistic way where you do the specialization, but in the beginning or on the end, you bring all of these perspectives together. And when we talk about design and planning, I think one unsaid rule, or probably one of the important rules, is to say how you can make it more inclusive or not, right? The way you design, the way you create spaces, in some ways can be intimidating to some section of people who voluntarily will not probably enter those spaces.
Yes.
So I think being conscious of these things is probably very important. It's not just about the physical thing that we design or build, but it's also about what is it that we promote through these things is probably important as well.
There's another interesting set of guys called the urban designers. So how do you think they can contribute to all this?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think urban designers as a group, because I'm not one, I would probably say is very important piece in this larger puzzle. But they bridge that gap between like at a building level to the city level, right? They are that key piece in between that. Unfortunately, I think in India there hasn't been much space to build this as a very important profession to show what impact that they can bring. But maybe if I can again give another example. So I work in the climate change space, right? And increasing heat is of big concern. So in a couple of discussions with other organizations who work closely with domestic workers have said that they work in multiple houses. So, but in between one house to the other house, they don't go back home because they just hang around. So they go sit in the park or public space, right? And where are these spaces in our cities? I mean, I'm talking about domestic workers and that as an example, but in general, for anyone, there is no space as such. And I think urban designers are key to kind of like bridge those spaces, those quality spaces that's required sort of in a city. And this hyper-local plans, again, from a climate change perspective, is very important. And I think COVID-19 pandemic also sort of highlighted this, right? About quality of living, about spaces of where we can go and things like that. I think those discussions have gained importance again. But I think there's a lot to do in this space. I think there are very handful of examples that we can talk about, maybe in Ahmedabad, the riverfront or the lakefront. I think we need more of these spaces. And that's what makes a city what it is and gives people those other opportunities as well. I think another example I can also give is the tactile urbanism. I think that's gaining significance, mostly when we're talking about behavioral change for using cycles or non-motorized transport. I think this is experimented in many cities. And even the Rahagiri campaign that used to happen, I think, is a great example to get people to appreciate what urban design is and what public spaces is. Because if you don't know what it is, then you can't ask for it. So only when you're like introduced to this and through these campaigns and demonstrate it and change behaviors, we'll hopefully have a lot more ask from the public. And then I think urban designers will become the champion at that point, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm totally flattered, Vaishnavi, very flattered. Thank you so much. So today is World Urbanism Day. So any thoughts that you have to share is something to do with, we've spoken enough about Indian cities, but anything else that you would like to talk of on this World Urbanism Day?
Right. I think when we talk about Indian cities, we only hear complaints like Bangalore's traffic, Delhi's air pollution, and I don't know, no space in Mumbai and, things like that. But I'm going to be hopeful and sort of an optimist here because of the special day.
Right.
At least when I'm going to go back to India because we're going to have, I think, close to 50% of India's population will be urban by 2050. And we're going to have a lot more cities, like I think close to 40 cities with million plus population, which will grow. From, I think we are around 40-ish now, it'll go to 68. So I think that's where these secondary, the small and medium cities become important. And the mistakes we've done in these large cities and the opportunities we've lost is something that we can try and make sure doesn't happen in these cities. I think there's this critical window of opportunity that exists that we can leverage, and that's why I'm saying I'm optimist in that sense.
Right.
It's just a matter of shifting gears and looking at development, not just looking at economic growth. I understand that's very important and that's what brings people to cities, but it's also important to place people and the environment at the heart of this discourse, which is gaining importance. Again, when we bring the climate change lens to it, it gets more significance. And I'm going to be hopeful, and I hope that's where we reach in the next decade or so.
So you are now touching upon sustainability aspect of cities as well. So should we talk about good urban development, or should we talk about sustainability, or you want to talk about both of them together? My problem is if you start doing both of them together, isn't it too much? So we are neither here nor there, stuck in between. For how long? What are your thoughts?
I feel they are the two sides of the same coin. I think it's a matter of breaking this down, like sustainability, what it is, and then it would make sense. Like the concept of sustainability comes from overconsumption and depleting resources. And why is that happening? Because of development, right? So I feel it's the same piece basically. So if I can give an example of maybe energy use. Say today is Sunday, I say I don't want to go anywhere, I'm going to stay at home, and but it's hot, so I use the fan or the AC. But if I'm living in a house which is well designed with passive cooling, I don't need to use a fan or AC, right? So it's my house, it's an infrastructure, it's development. But if that sustainability lens was there in it, right, then the choices are already made differently over there. Or if I choose to go out, I don't have footpath, I don't have metro, so I probably take a private vehicle, and you're like burning fuels. But if there is a very nice, pathway, and then there's metro efficient one that I can use, then I'll probably choose that option. So giving those options that exist and for people to make those informed sort of choices is also important. And that's where the sustainability angle comes, and that's where the development angle also comes in the same picture. So that's why I feel it's the same, it's two sides of the same coin. It's just a matter of breaking it down and looking at it from the sustainability lens. It's not too much, it's the need of the hour.
True. And totally understand. This is not your first time your engagement with BMS School of Architecture. You had earlier delivered a lecture on climate change on Knowledge Series. To our viewers, the link is given in the description. You can check that out. So Vaishnavi, I want to ask you, in that lecture, you have spoken a lot on water. So let's now talk about water in an urban area. It's so basic. But we are in such poor state. Could you sort of elaborate on something on that.
Right. I think water is the basis of settlements. I think if we go all the way back to Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, there are many studies which kind of prove that the entire settlements move from the west to the Gangetic Plain only in search of water, right? I think this is the heart of how we settle what we do, but I think at some point that significance was kind of like lost and it became like our backyard. And with the growth and with the kind of development that we have, with lack of permeable surfaces like encroaching lakes and like chopping trees, all of those things, there's no space for water. There's no space for water to flow, to percolate, to collect, and we blame it as flooding, but it's our own doing. We can't blame the nature for this. Like if you were to build in a low-lying area, what do you expect, right?
Right.
But at the same time, in India, predominantly all of the cities rely heavily on groundwater. So if one aspect is we're going to talk about like say flooding or no water, it's also about groundwater, and we're not recharging it, but we're heavily dependent on that. But there are some practices, and I can probably talk about Bangalore. And I think this cyclic sort of events of say flooding and water scarcity is an example that we see in Chennai, we see in Bangalore. These are big cities, so we hear a lot about it, but this is happening across. And we can't blame nature or climate change for this. I think predominantly it is our own doing, and how we undo it is what is probably important. Maybe I can give again some examples here. In Bangalore, I mean, there's a rainwater harvesting policy, right? If your building is beyond certain square meters, you have to have rainwater, recharge your ground at least. And I think recently they also introduced charges for extracting groundwater. It's a bare minimum, but it's a start, because even in the apartment I live, we get tank water from the tankers, and of course they're extracting it from somewhere. And recharging water in that sense, I think the Million Wells campaign in Bangalore is again a very great example. It's not only about reviving those traditional practices, looking at groundwater recharge, but it's also about livelihoods. And there's another study done by Well Labs. I think this was during the crisis in Bangalore with the lack of water. Interestingly, the study also came around the same time, and what they said was, if we can reuse the treated grey water that already exists, we will not have this problem of water scarcity. It's a simple thing, right? We are anyway treating this water, just reuse it. Reuse it beyond the secondary and tertiary uses. Start using it for, domestic use as well, but treat it to that extent. It is possible. So these solutions exist. And we also know our mistakes. It's just a matter of trying to rethink this entire process in that sense. And in the previous place that I worked in NIUA, there was another sort of initiative which looked at river-centric master plan. So they brought the river at the center of master plans. And then they're scaling this up. They started in Kanpur. I think they're doing this for Delhi and many other cities. Again, bringing that conversation of water at the heart of planning, basically. So I think policy, regulation, these plans and initiatives is something that we understand. But I think individual behaviors in water consumption is probably also very, very important. So I started using RO very recently after I shifted to Bangalore, because the TDS is quite high.
Yes.
And every liter you use, there's like 3 liters of water getting wasted, right? And I didn't want to do that. So I actually collect that water in a separate bucket and use that for cleaning and watering plants and things like that. Now, I don't know how many people actually do that, because and I think RO, a lot of them are using, if we take just Bangalore as a case, and imagine that amount of wastage of that water, right? And because we don't treat all of our wastewater as of yet, it's wasted. So I think at the large level, when you talk about policy and planning that exist, projects exist, but I think we also have to emphasize on individual behaviors, on how we consume water as well.
So there's a lot of conversation on climate change. You also touched upon it in the beginning of the session. So there's this climate change going on, and it's more evident when it rains, especially in Bangalore city. And so how do we get around with all these?
I can think of 2 ways. One is reactionary mode and one is precautionary mode. So right now in many places it has to be reactionary in nature. There have to be retrofits. We have to expand our stormwater drainage. Interestingly, the government has support from the World Bank, and they're going to roll out a large stormwater drainage program in Bangalore. And hopefully the areas which doesn't have this will start getting this infrastructure. And there's also another example of the Raja colorways in Bangalore, right? This is a network of the stormwater drains that exist, but a lot of them have solid waste management or encroachment, and they don't really work in the way they're supposed to work. And the K100 project, I think that's a great example, because I think even before they completed it, I think I don't know exactly when, but when it rained, those areas were not flooded. And this was still during the process itself. So I think that's another great example. There are examples, and I think we also understand the reason. I think in Kormangla, the flooding that happened recently was because the lake wall kind of like broke, and then the water from there also overflow into it, right? So we have to revisit our infrastructure, look at the status, expand the infrastructure, and wherever possible, look at introducing nature-based solutions to slow the runoff of water, to absorb it and to collect it. While these are reactionary, I think precautionary is in the future development. Like, I think the case of the number of lakes in Bangalore and what we've lost is pretty well known. But what are we doing in the future? Like, make sure that we don't make development in these areas, like preserve them and conserve them. It has to be like very strongly kind of like mandated in a way. And what's important in flooding because of climate change is it's not like, oh, we have flooding for 3 days and then flooding happens. The scenario now is cloud outburst, which means immense rainfall in a short duration. And for this, the kind of interventions would be very, very different. So we have to bring in that angle of why this flooding is happening, not just because of infrastructure or lack of infrastructure, but also the duration in that sense, right? Like with climate change, what are the things that's changing and how do we address that? So I think bringing in these two aspects and looking at existing solutions and scaling it up would probably to some extent solve the problem.
Yeah, I was on that note. There are a lot of good practices. We are not the only country who's flooding. There are other countries who are flooding, and they've successfully sort of managed crisis. How difficult is for us to just adopt the model and sort of implement? Is this process so difficult that we are not able to get it done?
I think replicating models is not really difficult, but I think contextualizing that to the places where we want to bring it is probably one additional sort of a task that's required, especially when we're looking at resilience. Maybe one classic example would be the bus rapid transit, which started off in South America. They were able to do it extensively, but the ones we've replicated in India haven't really worked. Only reason being that the last mile connectivity and all of those things really didn't come into place, right? While that's just an example of replication, but there are many other examples in cities trying to explore them. But it has to come with the say the political will and the ecosystem pushing for it and the people asking for it, all coming together for sort of things to happen. Rotterdam, Netherlands has been like a front runner for looking at water because they at the lower than the sea level, right? So they have something called water squares. And Surat, there was a program where there was twinning of cities, and I think Surat was clubbed with Rotterdam, and they're trying to replicate that in Surat. So water squares is basically, it's a square, but it's also like a heavy infrastructure where you store that water underground or on the surface only when there's flooding and things like that. And I think using permeable surfaces is a well-established sort of an example for looking at reducing water stagnation. And I can give another example of Paris, which is called the Oasis Schoolyard. So they picked up a couple of schoolyards and changed their surface to permeable surfaces, and they were able to address some amount of stormwater drainage, and in a sense also reduce temperature to some extent because it was green in nature. Another replication that I can think of is in the London master plan. They have something called a greening factor, which is for a given plot, and this varies from say ward to ward. They develop that depending on the ward. There's a set percentage of space you have to leave open either for a water body or for green spaces, and Delhi has replicated similar sort of a strategy in their master plan. While the master plan is yet to be notified, that replication kind of has happened. And another classic example of this replication is cool roofs. So Ahmedabad again pioneered this in 2015 when they had a heat action plan. And this was in informal settlements where you don't have proper roof and or even enough height inside they just painted the roof white, and that reduced the temperature inside, or putting insulation. And these pilots have been done across in many cities, and the success is also proven. But now it's a matter of scaling it up across the city. So I think replication exists, but as pilots, but scaling up is what I think we need to get there.
Right. All right. On a lighter note, you've lived in Bangalore, you've lived in Ahmedabad, London, Delhi. And now you're back to Bangalore. Where does your heart truly lie?
I feel each city shapes you as a person and sort of a lifestyle you choose. In Ahmedabad, for me, it was more about art and architecture and heritage, and that was also in the early years of architecture. So I was in awe with the city, learning a lot more about these. In London, it was about my lifestyle because of the tube, because of walking and cycling. I spent a lot of time walking, and that kind of tunes how you plan your day, because if you choose to walk, you'll probably spend more time, but then you have multiple breaks in between, you do multiple things in between, you probably go to a museum very quickly, do something. So I feel these cities shape how you decide to live your day and your life. In Delhi, it was mostly comparable to London with respect to at least transport coverage and art and heritage. And I think winter picnics over there was a new phenomenon for me. I think that was there in London, but in Delhi, I did not really expect it. So in winters, and because there's so much green space in Delhi with so many parks, you see people with their families out there spending the entire day in the sun because it's so cold. So when the sun is there, you make the best use of it. So that was very interesting for me there. But although with the air pollution, I hesitated to be out for long hours. And now back in Bangalore, I would go back to my answer of the classic weather. I think after living out for so many years and I come back, I really appreciate it. And I know what that brings to my life. I'm able to go out to parks at any time in the day with my daughter. I can open the windows for fresh air, which I didn't do in Delhi. The option of just being in the open is something that I feel precious after having these other experiences. And I cherish that. So I think to answer your question, I would say make the best of what the city has to offer to you and how that can shape your lifestyle. And I feel I have a part of my heart in each of these cities. So I really can't pick a city.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Vaishnavi, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. The conversations are very engaging, and happy World Urbanism Day to you and to all of our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to We the City, a space where every perspective shapes our urban story. This podcast is by the MArch Urban Design Program at BMS School of Architecture, Yelahanka, Bengaluru. ಮುಂದಿನ ಬಾರಿ ಮತ್ತೆ ಭೇಟಿಯಾಗೋಣ. ಬರುವ ಭಾಗಗಳನ್ನು ಕಾದು ನೋಡಿರಿ. ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.